For 4 decades, whenever the name Ray Harryhausen appeared in the titles, audiences were in for a unique movie-going experience. His pioneering special effects, brilliant stop-motion animation work, and vivid imagination thrilled his fans and was an important influence on the next generation of filmmakers.
I've had the good fortune to be associated with Ray Harryhausen for over 30 years. I've been witness to his genius. His scenes and his sequences and his delivery have been superb and unmatched, so far as I know, in the annals of the motion picture industry. It's been a great pleasure of mine to see Ray at work. That power of concentration, his area of creative design, and his ability to do what today crews of 70 or 80 men are doing is certainly unmatched in cinematic history.
Yes, it all started in 1933 when I went to see a film called King Kong. And of course, when I got to the foyer of Grauman's Chinese, they had this enormous display of the bust of King Kong. And that was startling in itself. Inside, we were treated to a prologue, a jungle prologue, which was great showmanship. It tied the whole thing together. And of course, then the picture started with Max Steiner's wonderful, famous theme, and I haven't been the same since.
Once Ray was able to find out that Kong was brought to life by the process of stop-motion animation, he spent much of his teenage years creating his own creatures and bits of experimental footage. His mother's coat was sacrificed to become fur, and his parents' garage became his workshop.
I'll never forget that my parents encouraged me very considerably, which I think is very important. They didn't insist that I become a doctor or a lawyer or one of the more sound professions. And they encouraged me, not knowing that there was an end in sight. And I think that's something that's most valuable to one growing up. They took part in everything I did. I know my mother used to model the heads for me before I learned how to do my own sculpture. And my father would help build props and take part in building the armatures. So it became sort of a family hobby.
Those experiments in the garage led to his first job as an animator on George Pal's Puppetoons. Then, when World War II came along, Harryhausen joined the Signal Corps and was later transferred into Frank Capra's training film division.
When I got out of the Army, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. And it struck me that it might be interesting in stop-motion animation to make a series of fairy tales based on the Mother Goose stories. These are some of the characters that were included in that particular film.
Ray's fairy tale films are still being shown in schools, but it was while working on the first couple of these short subjects that the people behind King Kong were preparing a new film. Ray ended up becoming the first assistant to the man he considered his mentor, Willis O'Brien, on Mighty Joe Young. In the early 1950s, Ray went on to become the creator of the effects for a series of science fiction films, including It Came from Beneath the Sea and Earth versus the Flying Saucers, and began his long association with producer Charles H. Schneer. Science fiction films were considered B-movies back then, and one of Ray's biggest accomplishments was finding ways to get spectacular ideas on the screen for very little money.
So I devised a split screens technique that was able to use the realistic backgrounds and sandwich the animated model into a pre-photographed background.
The genesis of subject matter that Ray and I have worked on for the last 3 decades originates in various sources. For example, the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad started with a dozen drawings that Ray had done some years before I had met him, having hawked them to a number of studios and not getting any real response. I was fortunate. He showed me these drawings and I was able to sell the management of Columbia Pictures the idea that this picture should be made.
One of the big problems was that Charles wanted to do it in color. And we had just perfected a very good process for black and white, where you could hardly tell the difference between the original photography and the special effect photography. And I felt that there were many misgivings with color photography if we attempted to combine the live action and the animated figure in one scene. But nevertheless, Charles encouraged me to make some tests, and the result was The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad.
When we were looking for a Sinbad, in those days, Columbia Pictures had a roster of artists under contract to them. Amongst the young men they had, in addition to the late William Holden and Glenn Ford, was Kerwin Matthews. Kerwin Matthews made a splendid choice for us. He was handsome, he was vigorous, he was athletic, and he was totally dedicated to the job of being an actor.
I found myself on a plane, landed in Paris on Easter Sunday, changed planes, got on another plane, went to Granada, Spain, arrived in the middle of the night and stepped out of the plane and was driven in a horse and carriage to the Granada Palace, and I was introduced to Ray Harryhausen and put into a costume with jewels and a turban on my head, and in the middle of the night taken to a bedroom in this palace that was all dressed in gauze and silks and so forth and so on. And I said, well, what are we going to shoot? And he said, well, down here on the pillow is this little girl. And I spent the rest of my film, or that film, looking for little Kathy Crosby or Great Big Monsters.
This type of picture presents a big challenge to actors because they have to do what we call shadow boxing to a great degree. When they perform on the set, the character that they're performing with many times is not there, and they have to imagine it to be there. And found out in The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad that Kerwin Matthews was very talented at giving the impression that he was actually seeing something.
One of the most interesting sequences that's become a sort of 9 or 10 minute classic was a sequence involving a sword fight that Sinbad had with a skeleton. And this had to be worked out, and it was a little bit of trial and error, but the man who was helping me with my sword fighting also helped Ray in planning the way he would have to film it involving me. And we had to be so precise to make sure that the swords eventually met and so forth on the screen, that we started counting, the sword master and myself. We'd start counting, and finally we worked out that we were choreographing things exactly the way you'd choreograph a dance sequence in counts of 8. And we would work out a routine in a count of 8, and we'd do it. And eventually, when the camera was turning, we'd shoot it with the fencing master playing the skeleton and counting out the 8. Then we would keep the camera rolling, and he would run behind the camera, and we would do it again in the same beat, the same rhythm, without the fencing master there for Ray to have the film to put the skeleton in. And with Bernard Herrmann's music, it's almost a dance sequence, but it's pretty special and so typical of the special things that Ray could do.
One of the biggest challenges in making this film was that they were always battling a tight schedule and an even tighter budget.
When we went on location in Europe for the first time in color, we went to Spain, a very remote area, to shoot The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, and we had a part Spanish crew. And the Spanish camera people and the people in the film industry were very new at it in those days, before all the spectacles were later made in Spain, which was in the 60s. And we had gone to this remote location. Of course, the Spanish prop man was responsible for having the swords for Sinbad and his men. And we were miles and miles from civilization. It was hard to get to. We had to go on pony back in order to get there. Vehicles, there were no vehicles there, no roads. And he forgot to bring the swords. And we really had to shoot, and we couldn't wait for him to go back to the base to get the swords. And sure enough, the ingenuity was there. They got a knife out, and they started chopping down some trees and sharpening some blades out of the tree trunks, and we painted them with silver, and it started to rain, and you never know the difference that they weren't real swords. And he came to me at the end of the shooting that day, and he said, you know, he said, we're very eager and we're very anxious, but you must remember we're very cheap.
I got very ill in Barcelona, and we had one shot left to make involving one of Columbus's ships, the Santa Maria or Pinta or something. It was in the harbor, and we'd been using it. And they had to do a storm sequence. The fire department had been hired to spray all the water from the harbor all over us and so forth and so on. But I was in bed with a temperature of 100 and something. And Charles came and very kindly said, would I come and do this one shot? And I said, yes, of course. And so I got out of bed, and they propped me up in front of a wheel on the boat, and the fire department started siphoning the water out of the harbor with all the dead rats and everything else hitting us in the face. And that particular shot is the record album cover on the Bernard Herrmann Sinbad music. It's quite a shot, but I'll never forget it.
After the film is shot, all of the film goes back to Ray Harryhausen in his little studio, and he spends anywhere from 14 to 18 months putting it all together. When I say putting it all together, I don't mean as an editor would edit a film. I mean to add all the missing characters in the frames where the live characters appear.
When I finally got to see the film, it was in a theater in Monte Carlo, and I couldn't believe that it was the same film I'd worked on. Not at all. When all those monsters came to life, and the Cyclops and all the special effects, I was as carried away as if I weren't in it.
There'll always be room for good fantasy film. It stretches the imagination. I think it'll be a staple in filmmaking for many years to come.